Hello, and welcome to We Aren't Just Pet Rabbits, Balancing Measurements and Definitions of Poverty. In the course of the next 10 minutes, we will examine exactly that, what it is to be poor and how we can feasibly account for that.
We care about poverty in the first place because it is an issue of human dignity and we are all human. As humans, we ought to do what we can to alleviate the undeserved suffering of fellow humans. But before we can provide solutions, we need to know, how should we define and measure poverty in the U.S. today?
To that we say, poverty ought to be defined as one's incapacity to make choices based on moral grounds rather than the pure motivation for survival. Poverty ought to be measured with a quasi-relative system that accounts for income and resources in relation to what other people have. So let's get started.
When most people think of poverty, they think of money, or a lack thereof. But in reality, looking solely at income does not give us the full story of what it means to be poor, because money does not equate to humanity, and as we said earlier, poverty is a human issue.
For example, meet Martha. She is 42 years old, a single mom of 2 kids, and works as a manager at a local restaurant. Because she is caring for herself and 2 others, she should need about $20,000 a year to provide for her family. Martha makes $24,300 a year. So, Martha and her kids aren't poor. But wait a second, can it really be that simple? Let's look a little deeper into Martha's situation.
Martha's younger son has juvenile diabetes and requires thousands of dollars every year to pay for his insulin and other medical necessities. The only way that Martha can make ends meet is by working lots of extra shifts at the restaurant and picking up the odd job around town, leaving a lot of responsibility to her 16-year-old daughter to take care of her brother as well as her own needs. When Martha gets home from work, she has neither the time nor the energy to properly care for her kids and to be the mother she wants to be. Now, is Martha poor?
Luckily, economist Amartya Sen answers this question with his capabilities approach to poverty. He argues in favor of defining poverty outside of income by first making a distinction between income lowness and income inadequacy. Having a yearly income just above the arbitrary number of the poverty line may keep you out of the poorest group, but that does not mean your income is adequate to fill your personal needs. As we saw in Martha's example, she does not qualify as having income lowness because she makes above the poverty line, but her income is still inadequate to afford her son's medical costs. Because of this disparity, Sen's focus is not on how much money one makes, but rather what he calls capabilities.
At the basis of capabilities are functionings, what one can do or be. Functionings can be as simple as the ability to consistently find a meal. Capabilities are then the set of functionings from which one can choose any combination of things to do and be. So, the functioning of proper nutrition along with shelter, utilities, and healthcare combine to make the capability of good health. It's important to note that just because someone has a capability does not mean that they will make the choice to achieve with it. Individuals with the functioning to vote and the capability of participating in their community may choose not to vote because they don't personally see value in it. But because those people have their basic needs met and their choice is based simply on their agency, we should not count these people as poor. But the basis of Sen's argument relies on answering the question of why do we care about studying poverty? And at its core, that means we have to define what it means to be human. We could say that it is the need to eat and drink and have shelter and warmth, but that doesn't make humans any better than pet rabbits. If we measure poverty as a lack of income that buys us essential resources, we are equating a decent human life with the existence of a pet rabbit. And we would hope that human lives are a little more important than rabbit lives.
We think that the most important defining factor that makes us human in this context is to do more than just survive. We should also be able to act as moral agents without worrying about having to sacrifice one of the essential resources. Let's go back to Martha. For example, if Martha believes her restaurant owner requires an unsafe amount of chemical additives in the food, she should be able to leave that job and find a new one without worrying about whether or not she can feed her kids. What we mean by moral agency specifically is the ability to tell right and wrong and act on it as one feels appropriate. We as humans also have the ability to think about the future and about more than just surviving. Pet rabbits don't sit there and wonder how they're going to send their kids to college, but people do. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum adds to Sen's capability approach and specifies a list of 10 critical capabilities, including life, bodily health, bodily integrity, thought, senses, and imagination, emotion, practical reasoning, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. Some, like life, are simple enough to understand, but others need some explanation.
Thought, senses, and imagination refers to freedom of expression and the right to a basic education with which one may choose to do as he or she wants. Affiliation has to do with one's participation in his or her social environment, for example, being able to participate in organized religion, associate with political groups, or even form meaningful relationships with friends and family. Other species describes one's interaction with nature and how aware one is of life other than humans. With these 10 capabilities in mind, let's go back to Martha, the restaurant manager. Martha has some, but not all, of the 10 capabilities on Nussbaum's list. Since she doesn't have leisure time or the time to devote to caring for her kids, she lacks play and affiliation. We saw earlier that, according to a hard and fast definition based on income, Martha isn't poor, but does lacking those two capabilities make her poor? Well, her limited social interactions prevent her from the experiential learning that would allow her to better understand her fellow humans, and thus she somewhat lacks the capacity to sympathize and deal with ideas of good and bad. Because we believe poverty means the inability to act morally outside of a primal instinct for survival, Martha is in fact poor.
As we can see from the above example, defining poverty as simply a lack of income fails to recognize those whose inadequate income cannot translate into capabilities that afford them human dignity. The pros of the capability approach, as we have mentioned, are that this way of measuring poverty is more encompassing of what it means to be human, rather than just a number that tells you whether or not you are poor. But here's the second part of our problem. The main reason we have stuck to this numerical definition of poverty is because its simplicity and quantitative nature make it easy to measure. How are we supposed to measure people's capabilities and moral agency?
First, let's examine the status quo. The U.S. Census Bureau currently uses the OPM, or the official poverty measure. Basically, the poverty line is set by determining the median cost of food for the household, however many people that may be, and multiplying it by 3. The OPM is an absolute measurement, which means that poverty is able to be quantitatively measured by a single number. It also means that poverty is not measured by the incomes of people in their surrounding area, where things generally cost about the same. The cost of living is different across the country, so having one measurement to account for all of those contexts obscures a lot of disparities. The reality is that it does not really include all the expenses of a normal household, and it is not flexible at all. The U.S. Census Bureau defines a household as those people living together that are related by blood or marriage, and we don't have time to unpack all of that. So Martha's poverty line for 3 people in her household is $20,420. That means if she makes $20,000 and $421, they are considered not poor, which is not fair and frankly makes no sense. For example, the OPM does not take into account things like medical care costs, child care costs, utilities, or transportation, both work-related and not. This makes it hard to construct a fair idea of poverty, as you saw in the example of Martha's life. So why is this our default? The U.S. Census Bureau basically wants to have records that will give us predictive abilities. The OPM was established in 1978, and therefore we are able to see the trends over time. Moving to a different system, even if it is a better measure, would make us have to start all over again with the data about poverty in the U.S.
But maybe we don't have to start over entirely. To make up for the shortcomings of the OPM, Kathleen Short created the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM, to fill in the gaps but not completely replace the OPM. Short believes that a more accurate measurement of poverty calculates the threshold with the median cost of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, or FCSU, divided by 3 that sets the basis for the poverty threshold instead of the 3 times food cost estimate of the OPM. The SPM also takes into account in-kind benefits that include SNAP, previously known as food stamps, and TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, in addition to one's regular income. Then it subtracts the cost of childcare, medical out-of-pocket expenses, or MOOPs, and work-related transportation to see if one qualifies as poor. The thresholds are also adjusted for regional differences. That's another one of the issues the OPM ignores. Living in a big city means a higher cost of living but more job availability, while living in the country might be seemingly cheaper, but jobs are scarce and come with expensive transportation costs. With the adjustment for geographic differences, the SPM paints a much more honest picture of what it means to be poor.
But as we pointed out earlier, poverty goes beyond money. How can we measure individuals' capabilities? A third measurement of poverty is the Human Development Index, or HDI. This measurement system gathers data about life expectancy, level of education, and GDP. While still taking into account money, the HDI can evaluate the capabilities of life, bodily health, and thought, senses, and imagination, which is the best way we have to measure capabilities thus far.
So in summation, absolute poverty measures are simple because they are one number, but they don't accurately measure poverty. Relative poverty measures, such as the SPM, are good because they take into account what other people have and thus better reflect one's situation within their community. But the thing about relative measures is that they are still relative. For example, in an area where everyone is rich, but they still have a relative measure of poverty, then some of the, quote, poor people are actually rich. And in a poor area, those at the high end of the relative scale can still be poor.
So how should we measure poverty? We believe that we should use a quasi-relative measure and basically take the best of both worlds from an absolute measure and a relative measure. We also want to make sure that the capabilities approach is the most influential, because although income is important because income provides for capabilities, it's the capabilities that really determine what one is able to do. The biggest thing to be aware of is the ability to choose. It's not really a choice if one has to choose between buying food and buying essential medicine. We believe that one is poor if most of one's decisions stem from needing to survive.
Poverty is the state of a human who is not being treated like a human, those who can't live a life beyond surviving. Now that we have a good understanding of what poverty is and how we can measure it, we have a responsibility to help fix it. Thank you.